She was found on the floor, wearing only a shirt, no corset, with dried blood on her lips and traces of vomit on her cheeks. The servants claimed that the fall was accidental, but the reports of the court physicians mentioned red-purple stripes on her skin from her waist to her chest, as if from a belt or ropes. Whether she hit herself or was held back remains unclear, but it was on that night that what would later be called the dark month of the Chambers began. By the beginning of these events, the Queen, who was in her 37th year, hardly ever left her bedroom. Her face was covered with pale grey spots, and dark, almost black circles appeared under her eyes. The smell from her was so pungent that no one entered the room without vinegar rags over their faces. The ladies of the court whispered that the decay had begun while she was still alive. The doctors explained it all away as black bile stagnation, attributing it to years of abstinence, night visions, and constant fear of punishment for her sins. However, far more dangerous rumors spread beyond her chambers. In the old quarters of the capital, it was said that the Queen, who had sworn virginity before the Archbishop, had secretly given birth to 2 children whom no one had ever seen at court. Some claimed that they had died as infants and were buried in the monastery garden. Others said that they had been taken away to distant provinces to be raised as commoners. These whispers became weapons in the hands of the courtiers, and each new week of illness only intensified the enmity between the factions of the nobility. At the onset of her illness, ordinary remedies were used: warm baths with rose water, rubbing with lard, and prayers at her bedside. But soon, the attacks of weakness and pain in her lower abdomen became so severe that it was necessary to resort to bloodletting 3 times a week. Thick, dark blood flowed from her veins, and after the procedures, the Queen lost consciousness. One day, as the senior physician recorded in his journal, she woke up and asked how many babies had died in the monastery that year. No one answered. Access to her chambers was strictly limited. 4 guards stood watch at the door, changing every 6 hours. Only her confessor, 2 doctors, and the senior lady in waiting were allowed to approach the bed. Letters to foreign ambassadors said that the Queen was in a state of holy seclusion, but the ambassadors themselves knew the truth. Rumors of her possible pregnancy in the past and her current illness made her power increasingly illusory. Behind thick curtains, by candlelight, endless procedures were carried out. Doctors administered decoctions of dried herbs, including hemlock and poppy heads. At night, when the room became stuffy and the smell of her body intensified, the ladies in waiting brought bowls of hot coals onto which they threw incense. Sometimes this helped, sometimes the Queen began to suffocate, clutching her throat, and then the windows had to be opened to let in the cold night air. Reports from servants, compiled after her death, mention that in her last weeks she often spoke to invisible children and asked for blankets and bread for them. Sometimes, barely opening her eyes, she whispered orders to remove that monk from the room, although there was no one there. Some considered these oddities a sign of fever, others divine punishment. Meanwhile, a struggle for influence was underway in the council chamber. The old nobility insisted on preserving the line of succession through a distant male relative. The new entourage, associated with the Queen's mother, tried to impose one of her younger cousins as heir, promising generous land grants if he was enthroned. The Queen's illness made her a mere symbol, and her silence was a blessing for intrigue. The days passed monotonously. In the morning, There was more bloodletting. In the evening, ointments made from lard and ash, sometimes with crushed pearls added, which were considered a remedy for decay. At night, there was delirium, the sound of footsteps behind the door, and the smell of vinegar, which could no longer mask the stench. In one of the confessor's letters, preserved in the monastery archives, there are the lines: "She does not fear death, but the question of what will happen to her soul if those who cannot be spoken of appear at the judgment." This phrase was later interpreted as a hint at secret children. But then, within the cold walls of the palace, it sounded like a confession of guilt that could no longer be washed away with prayers. And that was only the beginning. The illness did not stop. It was just waiting for its moment to strike with full force. And with each passing day, the faces of the courtiers grew darker, and the candles in the chambers burned longer and longer. By the middle of winter, the Queen's illness had progressed to a stage that the senior physician described in his report as putrefactive tissue decay. Black hard patches appeared on her thighs and buttocks, oozing pus with a pungent odor. The physicians explained this as stagnation of bad blood, and stubbornly continued the bloodletting, even though after each procedure, the Queen lost so much strength that she had to be given wine-diluted milk to drink so that she could speak. In the evenings, by the dim light of lamps, the ladies-in-waiting treated the wounds with warm vinegar and ashes mixed with fat, as prescribed by the medical books of the time. When she was turned on her side, her skin peeled off in layers, and the servants holding the basin of water tried not to look at the flesh beneath. One of the young maids vomited right there in the chamber. She was immediately taken away, and her name was crossed off the list of those allowed to visit the sick. Access to the bedroom became even stricter. Now, even her confessor could only see her in the presence of guards. The council explained this as concern for her health, but the real reason was different. Rumors of her delirium and strange conversations with children who were not there began to spread throughout the city. People crowded around the palace, hoping to catch a glimpse of the Queen, but they were not allowed near the gates. In early February, an envoy from the Northern Duchy arrived at the palace. His master offered to send a doctor who had saved the lives of 3 sovereigns, but the council rejected the offer, not because they doubted his skills, but because the appearance of a foreign doctor could reveal the truth. The Queen was unlikely to live until spring. At this time, the struggle for the inheritance became overt. At secret meetings by the fireplace, the old families agreed on an alliance against the new entourage, bribing guards and scribes. Rumors circulated that at one such meeting, it was discussed whether to hasten the Queen's death for the good of the crown. But any action was delayed by the disease itself, which was already moving faster than any conspiracy. In mid-February, the Queen began bleeding, unrelated to her wounds. The doctors who examined her exchanged glances and remained silent. One of them, later questioned, said, "This happens to women who have kept their births a secret." Rumors about her secret children flared up again, and now not only in the capital, but also beyond its borders. At night, her cries could be heard in the corridor. She called out someone's name, which the servants did not dare repeat. Sometimes, she grabbed the ladies-in-waiting by the hands, begging them not to send them to the convent. The ladies-in-waiting swore they did not know who she was talking about, but everyone understood. She was talking about those who had never been seen in the castle. The smell in the bedroom became so unbearable that one of the guards on duty at the door complained of dizziness and stomach pains. The council ordered the rooms to be fumigated with juniper and incense, but this only mixed the stench with the heavy aroma of the incense. From a letter from a court scribe to his brother, I saw her being lifted from her bed for washing. Her arms and legs were like sticks. Her stomach was swollen, and her skin was dark green in places. The doctors whispered that this was a sign of her imminent death, but she was still breathing, and her eyes were open. Sometimes there was intelligence in them, sometimes only emptiness. Meanwhile, in the council chamber, they began to prepare the texts of future decrees on behalf of Her Majesty. They forged her signature and affixed seals. One of the decrees was to confirm the new heir. Another, to confirm land grants. Those who were not involved in this work knew that if the Queen died without these documents, power could pass to a completely different house, and then heads would roll. By the end of the month, the Queen had almost stopped eating. They poured broth into her mouth, but she would not swallow it. Sometimes, however, she asked for red wine and drank it as if only that could quench her thirst. After the wine, she began to rave and talk to them again. In the confessor's notes, written in the margins of the Psalter, there is a line: "I am no longer sure that she fears God. She is afraid of meeting those she has betrayed." And yet death did not come. The illness seemed to drag on every night, giving time to those who were already tearing her power to pieces. By the beginning of March, it was impossible to stay in the Queen's chambers for more than a quarter of an hour without risking vomiting. The guards were changed more often than prescribed, and the ladies-in-waiting tried to enter only in pairs so that at least one of them could hold the bowl if vomiting began. The doctors worked in silence, discussing her condition less and less, not because there was nothing to say, but because they knew that every word could be used against them. The Queen's body was now literally a source of decay. Deep bed sores had formed on her back, under her shoulder blades, oozing a grey-green liquid. Sometimes, when the bandages were changed, fly larvae were found in them, despite the winter and the cold in the chambers. The doctors cauterized the wounds with red-hot iron, after which the Queen lost consciousness for hours. The smell of burnt flesh mixed with the already familiar stench, and even incense could not drown it out. Her delirium became almost constant. She would whisper prayers, then scream at someone no one could see. Sometimes she called for her son, sometimes her daughter, always begging them not to come in white clothes. This frightened the servants the most. The people believed that dead children appeared to their parents in white to lure them away. At the same time, a real coup began inside the palace. The new entourage, which controlled access to the chambers, began secretly removing chests of silver from the treasury. The old families, learning of this, ordered their people to stand guard at the black entrance to intercept every cart. In the evenings, muffled cries and sounds of struggle could be heard in the narrow corridors of the palace. People were being taken away to the dungeons, and in the morning, no one remembered them. From a report by the captain of the guard, found in the archives decades later, in my presence, the Duke's advisor approached the doctor and said, "She is no longer a woman, but a carcass. Make her die quietly, and you will receive more than a year's salary for it." The doctor remained silent, but his hands were shaking. The first attempts to hasten her death were disguised as treatment. One evening, she was given a decoction of roots known to cause cardiac arrest in large doses. But the queen drank only half of it, the rest she spilled on her bed, and thus survived the night. 2 days later, a thick mercury-containing ointment was rubbed into her skin, supposedly to cleanse the body. This was followed by severe convulsions and fever. But even then, death did not come. Meanwhile, tension was growing in the capital. The people saw that the palace was locked and that priests were increasingly holding services for the health of the queen without her presence. In the markets, there was already open discussion about who would become the next ruler, and each option was accompanied by curses against the other side. In mid-March, her confessor tried to hear her confession. She was silent for a long time, then suddenly laughed and said, "Do you want to hear about them? Well, know this. They are still alive." The confessor, shocked, immediately left her chambers. This episode leaked to the council, and the very next day it was used in political conversations. Now it could be claimed that the heirs existed and could be found. Servants, questioned years later, said that in those days the queen hardly slept. She lay with her eyes open, staring into the darkness, and sometimes uttered words that sounded like curses. During the rare hours when she slept, her face was contorted as if she were continuing to scream in her sleep. Soon, the council made a decision. The palace had to be prepared for her imminent death. They began to clear the small halls for the future funeral ceremony, order fabrics for the burial garments, and send messengers to allies and vassals. All this was done in secret from the people, but inside the palace, every step betrayed the preparations for the end. And yet, she was still breathing, as if to spite everyone who was already waiting for her death. By the end of March, her condition had become so serious that even her most devoted ladies-in-waiting began to avoid her chambers. There was a constant warm stench of a decomposing body in the room. During the day, it was slightly weaker due to the open windows and the wind. But at night, when the windows were closed to avoid catching cold, the air became thick, like in a tomb. The doctors now worked almost mechanically, changing bandages, bleeding, rubbing ointments, but the blood was already flowing poorly, thick, clotted, sometimes not coming out at all, and then they pierced new veins. Sometimes the needles broke in the body and had to be pulled out with forceps. Once, when they tried to turn her from side to side, the bedsore on her back opened so deeply that white bone was visible. She could no longer speak in long sentences. Her words became shorter, her breathing labored. But sometimes, for a few minutes, her clarity returned, and in those moments she could whisper, "Are they still waiting for me?" The servants did not understand whom she meant, but they always turned away. During those same days, the palace was filled with whispers about an imminent change of guard. The council feared that the current guards would be loyal to another pretender to the throne. Several officers secretly swore allegiance to the Duke, and at night, when the candles were extinguished in the chambers, people were already changing shifts at the gates. At the same time, the conspirators became more active. They held a meeting in the dungeons, where they decided that if the queen did not die within 2 weeks, they would help her along. To this end, they prepared a special powder that could be dissolved in wine. But chance intervened. One of the young guards drank the poisoned wine and was found dead in the courtyard an hour later. The powder was disposed of, but the plan remained. From the report of a secret scribe, today she refused wine, saying that it smelled like a swamp. Apparently, rumors of attempts to poison her have reached her. Since then, she has been drinking only water served by the senior lady in waiting. Rumors spread like wildfire in the capital. Some said that the queen had died and her body was being hidden. Others said that she had fled to a convent and would rule from there. There were even tales circulating in the markets that she had given birth to a third child, who had already been secretly taken abroad. In early April, her body began to swell. Her face became round, her eyelids heavy, her lips cracked and covered with a crust. Her breathing was wheezy, each exhalation accompanied by a hollow whistle. Doctors attributed this to weak lungs and began applying bags of heated salt to her chest, but this only exacerbated the inflammation. Inside the palace, preparations were already underway to prepare the throne room for the new ruler. Documents were being rewritten and council dates were being set. Only one person in her entourage insisted that she be kept alive as long as possible: her confessor. He claimed that without repentance, she would not enter the kingdom, and demanded that she be allowed to confess. But the queen refused, turning away and covering her mouth each time. During those days, a new smell appeared in the chambers for the first time. A sweet, lingering smell that many recognized immediately. The smell of death when it is near. But even then she was still alive, clinging to every breath, as if she did not want to let go of those who were waiting for her end. The first days of April were cold and damp, and the fireplace in the Queen's chambers was lit again. But the heat only intensified the stench, and even the guards at the doors began to ask to be transferred to other posts. The doctors had almost stopped arguing among themselves. Everyone understood that the end was inevitable. Now they acted more as guardians of the body than as those trying to save it. On the evening of the fifth day, her breathing became rare, with long pauses. Her skin took on a grey-yellow hue. Her nails turned black, and her eyes sank deeply into their sockets. At dawn on the seventh day, everyone who was allowed access gathered in the chambers: 2 physicians, the senior lady in waiting, the confessor, and 3 guards. The doctors checked her pulse every few minutes. Around noon, the Queen suddenly opened her eyes and said clearly, "They are already here." The confessor leaned over to ask who exactly, but she turned away to the wall and did not speak again. Death came in the evening. Her last breath was barely audible, and only one of the doctors noticed that her chest was no longer rising. She was covered with a veil, and silence reigned in the room, broken only by the crackling of the coals in the fireplace. Immediately after her death, there was a flurry of activity. The guards drove even the ladies in waiting out of the chambers and ordered no one to approach. The doctors drew up a short report stating the cause of death as extreme exhaustion, without mentioning the ulcers, decay, or other details. Embalming proved almost impossible. The body had already begun to decompose while still alive, and the internal organs gave off such a foul odor that even experienced craftsmen had to work with handkerchiefs soaked in vinegar. The skin was coming off in places, along with the clothing, so it took 2 days to dress the body in funeral garments. All this time, the doors to the chambers remained locked, and reinforced guards stood outside the windows. The council met late into the night. Some demanded that a new ruler be proclaimed immediately, while others insisted on searching for the true heirs, alluding to rumors about her children. In the end, the new faction prevailed. Early in the morning, a decree was read out, signed by the Queen, a week before her death. naming one of her cousins as her successor. The news caused turmoil in the capital. Some mourned, others rejoiced openly, and still others demanded proof of her death. Crowds gathered at the palace gates, but no one was allowed in. Services were held in churches to pray for the repose of her soul, but many priests whispered that without confession and repentance, her soul would wander. Legends quickly spread among the people. Some swore that they had seen a woman in white, resembling the queen, walking toward a monastery outside the city at night. Others claimed that her children were already on their way to reclaim the throne. These rumors threatened to spark a rebellion, and the new council ordered that any talk on the subject be suppressed. The funeral took place behind closed doors, and without the presence of the people. The coffin was lowered into a crypt under the chapel, and only a small circle of people knew its exact location. However, the Queen's death did not bring peace. Within a month, uprisings began in the borderlands, and in the capital itself, clashes between supporters of different pretenders intensified. The alliances formed during her lifetime collapsed one after another. External enemies took advantage of the turmoil, and the country slowly descended into chaos. One of the chronicles of that time records, "She left without leaving any descendants, but she left a shadow that will hang over the throne until the end of the century."